How's it going, everyone? This is Jason Navarro. You're listening to Tongues Out Podcast, and let's just jump right into today's subject. This one, I can't believe this idea came to me from a Joe Rogan podcast. I just happen to sometimes, when I'm just doing things around the house or whatever, I'll let my YouTube kind of just autoplay different videos, and it just kind of it just plays whatever based off of like previous videos I've watched. And I do watch a lot of Joe Rogan, but I don't watch like every single episode of his. And today I was just doing some things around the house, and his episode with Alex Jones, who, by the way, I think is a really psychotic individual. I don't know if he's acting or if that's really how he is. There's a lot of claims that he's made claims that he's an actor and he does like he's just make believing this character that he plays a majority of the time. I just think that there's something psychotic about him. It's sad, and whatever it is, either drugs, born with it, or whatever it might be, it's just unfortunate. Actually, funny enough, when I was younger, I was a big fan of his. Actually, I'm not gonna lie, I was a huge fan of his. I was big into conspiracies, and his old stuff was actually not far off the reservation, and he had some interesting ideas, and he did a lot of more investigative work. But I don't know what happened to him since then, and he became very syndicated and big, and he started to just kind of go off the reservation on a lot of different things. But Joe Rogan and him are really good friends, and so he'll occasionally have him on his podcast, even though a lot of people that work for Spotify hate the fact that Joe Rogan has the ability to do that, since Alex Jones was kind of banned from almost every platform out there. And I don't think anyone really deserves to have a platform ever kind of like like their speech to be hindered, unless it's like a group of individuals that are promoting like hate, like direct hate and violence towards a specific group of people or an individual or whatever it might be. Those people probably need to get their voices minimized. But honestly, they're going to find their means of getting their points across in many different ways. But those are the only people I really feel like that deserve to have their voices, quieted or like reduced or eliminated on platforms. But Alex Jones, I thought it was very controversial how and again, I think this guy is something's wrong with him. Um, but I don't think he did enough to really justify getting completely removed off his platform. And we all have to remember that we live in America, and our ability to freedom of speech is a valued right of everyone. Whether I agree with your points or not, it is something that everyone is entitled to having. And the only thing, like I said, I am for is minimizing the speech of individuals that are promoting kind of hate and violence to people. But anyways, I just wanted to bring that up real quick. But I was listening to this podcast, and again, Alex Jones is kind of psychotic, and this is the most recent one he had with Joe Rogan. I think it was like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I laughed at a lot of his points, and he was very humorous. I mean, I think even Joe Rogan and I forget the name of the other guy that was on his show, they really found the concept to be very humorous as well. Some of the stuff, they were like, oh, this is kind of interesting what you're bringing up, but a majority of it, they were kind of laughing at him. He was also getting intoxicated on the show. But from listening to what he was talking about, I don't know why I thought about this. They were, at one point, Alex Jones asked Joe Rogan, what are your thoughts on the universe? Like, what are your thoughts? Like, who's in control of the universe, or like whatever. And it made me think of something that I found very interesting when I was introduced to the idea like 7 years ago. And it's the idea of the flatland. And I'm not entirely sure if any of you have ever heard of this subject, but they were talking about how they were talking about aliens. And that's actually where this came from. They were talking about aliens, and Joe Rogan was talking about how some people believe that aliens are either interdimensional beings or time travelers. And I did a podcast a while back on extraterrestrials and life outside this planet. And so I did a whole week. I dedicated a week into that subject. And actually the last day I brought up how my thoughts are that I don't think aliens are beings from another planet, because it wouldn't make any sense for them to come visit our planet. There's really nothing important here or of value that they couldn't find in other um, planets out there that essentially have life. I think what we're being visited by and why they're another reason why I feel like it's not aliens is because aliens have no reason to be hiding from us. Like essentially, if they're that superior, they could just go anywhere they want, show themselves to people, to the masses of amounts of people. And as even though it's very controversial for us and we'd be freaking out, to them, they're so powerful that it doesn't matter what kind of influence they have on us. They would have to be some extreme sentient beings to really perceive like, hey, we don't want to influence what's going on this planet and we just want to leave it alone. I think what it is that it's time travelers. And essentially, if you understand the idea of time travel, you're not supposed to have any direct influence on society or on anything of the matter. Because if you do, you could potentially affect the course of the future or a timeline, a specific timeline that they came to. You know, we've seen plenty of movies about time travel, so you kind of have the gist of it and what you can and can't do. And I feel like time travelers coming here under the guise of being aliens or extraterrestrials is a great way for them to hide the fact that they are future versions of ourselves coming here to learn more about us or whatever. Who knows? But when they were talking about possibly interdimensional beings, it got me to think about, like I said, the idea of flatland. And I never really grasped this idea until it was brought up by this super animated. It was Dr. Quantum. It was like this animated guy that was made for like a really weird movie, but it talked about weird weird effects that only quantum physics can explain. And this one has nothing really to do with quantum physics, but essentially it's the idea that every dimensional being perceives like they exist in a dimension that they're in, but they only could perceive within dimensions below where they exist in. So for instance, us, people listening to this podcast, and if you have the ability to see, we are three-dimensional objects. And a lot of people would say you can see in 3D, but that's not the case, because if I had the ability to see in 3D, I could, for instance, let's say this was a solid object, this water bottle in my hand. If this was a complete solid object, without turning this bottle, right? If you wrote me a message underneath the bottle, if I could see in 3D, I would not need to move this object at all and know what was written underneath this object. I would be able to perceive all aspects of the dimension of this bottle just by looking at it, by perceiving it. I know there's a three-dimensional object. I can feel it. I can look at it. I can perceive it. But I cannot see in 3D. That's impossible. You see in 2 dimensions. That's why when we watch movies, we watch them in, they're essentially stills or photos that are like photos on top of each other that make what looks like animated cinematic happen. But even though they're still frames that are bundled up together and played for us in a way that shows up as a movie. And so when you look at the world, everything is in 2 dimensions. What makes us unique, though, is that we have the ability to perceive things and perceive depth perception. So we understand that there's curves around objects, and shadows and lighting allows us to kind of see around certain things. And of course, if an object's clear, you can see through it as well. But if the object is solid, you obviously can't see through it, but you can kind of see the way light reflects off of it and lighting. And so you can have an idea that this is a 3rd-dimensional object, but you wouldn't be able to read a message anywhere on the object outside of just looking at it face forward. So what I'm getting at is that a 3-dimensional being, such as ourselves, can see in any dimension below that. So you can see in 2 dimensions, right? 2 dimensions are up, down, left, right. That's 2 dimensions. One-dimensional is only having the ability to go left and right. So a one-dimensional being, I wish I had a sheet of paper. Oh, I do right here. So this is just nothing personal is written on here. Oh, yeah, there is. I can't show that. It's work-related. Let's do... What is this? This is like a random sheet from like one of my RPG stuff. So essentially, if you're a one-dimensional being, this is your plane of this is your plane. A one-dimensional being can only go left and right. They have no ability to perceive what up and down is, because if this was a flat surface, they could only go forward and back, really. And that's it. They couldn't really perceive anything else. And so essentially a two-dimensional being that's on a sheet of paper, for instance, this is a two-dimensional plane, right? We could see in 2D. So that anything that's drawn on this piece of paper is a two-dimensional object. They couldn't see more than lines in front of them. They could only see in one dimensions. And so one of the things that I found so crazy when they were explaining this is that essentially, like, if I drew a world on this sheet of paper, on this two-dimensional world, right, I can see everything on it, right? If I drew stick figures, a house, everything, I could see what's inside the house. I could see the outside of the house. I could see people. I could see what's inside people. Like if I got very descriptive and drew like a person with organs inside of them, I could see their organs. As a third-dimensional being, I could reach in and erase things within their world, right? If these things were alive, I could erase their organs. I could go into their house without having to open a door. I could see through everything because everything's drawn out. And so we are essentially gods amongst those in a two-dimensional world. Same way a two-dimensional being would be a god amongst a one-dimensional plane, which I don't even know how to illustrate a one-dimensional plane. But when I was fascinated by the idea that we as people cannot perceive any dimensions above 3 dimensions. Like even we can't see 3-dimensional, but we can understand the idea of what a 3-dimensional object is because we are 3-dimensional and the world around us is 3-dimensional. But we don't know what a 4th-dimensional object would look like. It's impossible for us to ever understand what that is, or any dimension above 3D. And what's wild is that a 4th-dimensional being, because we have no idea whether that's a thing or not. We would have no idea because we can't perceive them. They could be all around us right now. We could have literally people or entities or things around us, right? Science can understand this point, and science thinks that, this universe is like a 27-dimensional universe, but we as humans can only perceive so much within this universe. But there could be entities that are higher level dimensional beings. We don't know what that would look like. You can't even imagine it. It's impossible. It's like there are different like 3-dimensional objects that have been illustrated to be shown like what it would look like if we saw a 4-dimensional object appear in our world. It looks crazy. Like let me start. I'm forgetting the term for dimensional Tesseract. Yeah, like the Tesseract in Marvel. I can't believe I forgot this. But a Tesseract essentially is a 4th-dimensional cube. And if I showed you what a Tesseract looks like simulated, you would be like, what the hell is that object? Exactly. There's no way to really draw what this thing is, but essentially it's a 3D cube of a cube. It's like a cube within a cube that's elongated and like length, width, and height all cubed out. It's just really, it's impossible to really illustrate with the idea because our minds can't even perceive it. But we could try with mathematics to understand what the dimensions of the thing would be, but you can't illustrate it because you can't put a let alone, it's hard to put a 3-dimensional object on a 2D plane. To put a 4th-dimensional object on a 2D plane is impossible. So I can't even look at it on a screen. But the way they would describe it is like if you could somehow see a 4th-dimensional square, like a Tesseract, come into this world real quick, it would look like as if it started off as a small, tiny cube and then expanded and then shrunk again. It would be like the weirdest looking object you would ever see. Um, but what's fascinating by like what I've always found of interest is this idea that these beings could influence our world without any effort whatsoever. Like literally would take just as much effort as it would take us to change the world of a two-dimensional world. I could erase it completely. I can put a new world in there. Four-dimensional beings could essentially do the same thing for us in a three-dimensional world. They could be our theoretical gods. That could be where God is. God could be a fourth dimensional being, right? If you're a religious person, you would argue he probably is a fourth dimensional being because he exists in a plane outside of our plane, and he's got the full capacity to do any level of work in our universe, essentially. But again, there's no way to prove that because we can never perceive what fourth dimensions or even 5, 6, 7, 8 dimensions would be. We could just understand the idea that there are dimensions, right? Because we could perceive dimensions below us, and we know that we are third dimensional, but we have no idea what anything beyond that is. And I'm so fascinated by that idea. And I have no idea where that came from Alex Jones, outside the fact that they were talking about interdimensional beings, but I've heard interdimensional beings plenty of times when talking about, whatever aliens could potentially be. But I don't know, this time around, it just reminded me of this, the first time I was introduced to this idea of and that's why it's called a flatland. It was like the idea was proposed by someone else that talked about a universe on a flat plane and how three-dimensional beings came and influenced this universe on this 2D plane. And super cool. Such a super cool idea. But anyways, I know it's like random compared to like what the past week has trended with me talking about documentaries or shows or movies. But that's what I find interesting on this podcast. And it's just cool to have a platform to do this. Anyways, thank you guys so much for listening to me talk about something that probably flew past a lot of you guys as to like, why am I talking about this? But until next time, I love you guys. Peace.